Welcome to a new session of God with Us, where we journey through the salvation story of the Bible. Today, I will take us through the final three phases of Israel's salvation story in the Old Testament, namely the exile to the nations, the diaspora or their time in exile, and the return from exile. Last week, we recounted the salvation story of Israel and we stopped at the point when they were exiled by God. We learned that the kings of both northern and southern kingdoms were persistently unfaithful to the covenant with God and they disobeyed the commandments of God. They were supposed to be good shepherds to their people to lead them in the way of the Lord, but instead they led them astray into idolatry. So the Lord gave the two kingdoms up to their enemies. The North Kingdom was defeated by the Syrians in 722 BC. The kingdom was destroyed, the people were exiled, and the land was resettled with foreigners. There was, however, a small remnant of Israel who remained in the land and intermarried with the foreigners whom the Assyrians resettled there. This group of Israelites continued to worship the Lord, only that they possess a different set of scriptures from the Jews. All that they have is a modified set of the law of Moses. And they also recognize a different holy place of worship. They worship at Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. And these people are the Samaritans, and they claim to be descendants from the tribes of Joseph and Levi. Well, the Old Testament doesn't really tell us much about them, and the narrative in the book of Kings regarded the Assyrian captivity as the end of the North Kingdom in salvation history. And we shall leave it as that. The South Kingdom was besieged by the Babylonians in 598 BC, and Jehoiachin, the king at that time, was captured by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and brought to Babylon. At the same time, King Nebuchadnezzar also deported about 8,000 men from Jerusalem to Babylon, and he made Judah a vassal state to Babylonia, which means that Judah is subject to the rule of Babylon. And then he installed Jehoiachin's uncle Zedekiah as a puppet ruler. However, despite warnings from the prophet Jeremiah, Zedekiah decided to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, this is an overestimation of his ability. In retaliation, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem before invading it and destroying the city and the temple in 586 BC. And most of the population was exiled. As for the people remaining in the land, Nebuchadnezzar appointed a good man, Gedaliah, to be the governor over them. However, when Gedaliah made a speech to try to convince the people to serve Babylonia, some members of the royal family who remained in the land staged rebellion, killed Gedaliah, and fled. And this event struck fear in the survivors of the land because they were scared that Nebuchadnezzar will retaliate, just like what he did with Zedekiah. So they decided to flee to Egypt despite the warnings from the prophet Jeremiah not to do so. So in the end, only the poorest of the poor remained in the land, living alongside foreigners from the surrounding nations. So we see that as a result for their disobedience, the people of God were judged by the Lord, and they were scattered all over Babylon, Egypt, and the region of Palestine. These scattered communities of the people of God are known as the diaspora. And the word diaspora comes from the Greek term for dispersion. Now, if you were one of those people who were displaced or deported, what do you think you would experience? Imagine having to live in a foreign country and not being able to return to Singapore. What do you think you will face in that foreign country? Well, I suppose you would face alienation, and not just alienation from your family and friends in Singapore, but also alienation from the locals in that new country. You may look different, talk different, and think different, and so find it difficult to interact with the locals. Or the locals may not want to make the effort to interact with you. You may even face hostility from some of the locals who don't want you there or simply want to take advantage of you. Then you will face disorientation because everything feels so new to you. The language is new, the culture is new, the places are new, and the people are new. It takes a long time to get used to the new country. So what will you need to do? You may have to learn a new language, get used to the local cuisine, immerse yourself in a local culture, blend in with the locals so you don't attract trouble, try to learn a new skill, find a job, get married to a local, and so on and so forth. Basically, you will want to shed your Singaporean identity and take on a new identity as time goes by. You will want to assimilate into this new culture. The people of Judah face similar pressures in exile as well, except that we have to remember that their identity is very closely tied to their status as the Lord's elect and their covenant with the Lord. Well, in the ancient world, all the nations had their own gods. The identity of the peoples were constituted by the deities that they worshipped. So, for example, Marduk was the primary god worshipped by the Babylonians, and his residence was in the temple in Babylon. So a Babylonian's life would revolve around his or her devotion to the god Marduk. And so for someone from Judah to assimilate to Babylonian culture would mean taking on the worship of the Babylonian gods like Marduk, as well as taking part in activities considered detestable to the Lord. Furthermore, the city of Jerusalem and the temple of the Lord had already been destroyed by the Babylonians, and by ancient standards, it would have seemed that the Lord God of Judah was powerless against the God of Babylon, Marduk. There was little reason for the people not to give up their identity in the Lord and simply just to assimilate to the pagan culture of the Babylonian society that they are now part of. And this is why the Lord sent word by his prophets to tell his people that it was because of their sin that he gave them up to judgment, not because he was less powerful than the gods of the other nations and therefore powerless to protect them. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, could do what they did only because they were his instruments of judgment for both the northern and southern kingdoms. And so he assured his people in exile that he remained in control and they should just keep calm and carry on. They were to live among the locals but not give in to temptation to apostatize, as he would eventually bring them back to Jerusalem after 70 years of exile. They were to remain faithful to the Lord in obedience despite the destruction of their temple and unable to make sacrifices to him. Now, the book of Daniel shows us what faithfulness in exile means through the story of Daniel and his friends in the Babylonian royal court. Well, Daniel and his friends were made to take on foreign-sounding Babylonian names which pay tribute to the foreign gods. They were made to eat unclean foods, to learn the Babylonian language and literature, and also to learn pagan practices which often involve astrology and divination. They were prevented from worshipping the Lord and were also made to take part in idolatrous ceremonies. However, despite being threatened with execution, Daniel and his friends remained faithful to the Lord, and the Lord showed himself true to them by bestowing his divine protection upon them. And so in this story, we have Daniel and his friends being thrown into the most dangerous situations and leading the most precarious lives as exiles because they were serving in the royal court and could be executed at any time for their missteps. Yet the Lord's providential care was upon them because of their devotion to him. And this story is meant to teach God's people that the Lord is active and mighty to save, even outside of Jerusalem, even deep within enemy territories. As long as they remain truly devoted to the Lord, his divine protection will be with them and they need not be fearful. As we will learn later, the Lord actually brought a group of exiles back to Jerusalem. However, there were many who chose to remain in the diaspora, and in Jesus' time, there were communities of Jews residing all across the place in Egypt, Greece, Palestine, and Rome. And we see this fact reflected in the book of Esther, which mentions Jews like Mordecai and Esther who chose to remain in Persia, even though they had the permission to return to Jerusalem. Now, the question is, are they still the people of God if they don't return? Well, the story tells us yes. The story of Esther is written as an expression of the confidence that the special providence of God continues to be with the Jews in the diaspora. The Lord continues to protect his elect people in foreign lands from their enemies, as long as they retain their collective identity as Jews and they remain faithful to the Lord. So we see that the providence of the Lord is with his people wherever they go. They need not fear alienation or disorientation and give in to the temptation to apostatize and to worship the foreign gods. Nor do they need to fear the hostilities of the people around them for refusing to worship their gods and maintaining a separate identity from them. All they need to do is just to walk the path of obedience of faith, and the Lord will be with them wherever they are. Now remember I mentioned about God's sovereignty. Now what does sovereignty mean? Well, in the dictionary, it's defined as a supreme power or authority, and is a political term. In our day, it refers to how states have the authority to govern themselves independent of other states. Well, so for example, Singapore is a sovereign power because we are an independent nation state, and no other nation in the world has the right to interfere in our politics. So when sovereignty is applied to God, it just means that God is the ultimate ruler over all political parties and rulers, and he is the supreme power that governs the affairs of the world. And we see God's sovereignty on display when the Jews were finally allowed to return to Jerusalem. This happened after the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon and established the Persian Empire. He allowed people groups who were exiled in the past to return and rebuild their temples and cities. They were allowed to worship their gods, govern themselves, and live in peace, as long as they were obedient to him and paid him taxes, of course. But in doing so, Cyrus is regarded by historians as a benevolent and humane king. And he is also a wise king in his governance. Part of the reason why he allowed the exiles to return to their homelands was also because he had a different governing strategy from the kings before him. He knew that, if he was to establish direct control over all the different conquered territories, that would be too taxing on his central government. And so he allowed the different people groups exiled by the past kings to return to their home territories in order that they may govern themselves. So this not only brought him favor with the peoples, it also relieved the burden of direct administration by his central government. What's amazing to us as Christians is that whatever motivations King Cyrus might have had in allowing all exiles to return to their homeland, the Lord fulfilled his word through this policy of his. Within the 70 years prophesied by Jeremiah, a remnant of the Israelites returned from exile according to his word. So the sovereign God worked his plan out through the wills of the earthly kings. He judged the people by their hands, and he also liberated the people by their hands, demonstrating that he is truly the sovereign one who has control over history, and he's able to fulfill every promise of his word, because everything goes according to his will. Now that the remnant returned to Jerusalem, they were concerned to re-establish their collective identity as the people of God. However, they also faced many challenges along the way. First, they needed to rebuild the temple, which is the place where the presence of the Lord will dwell, and also the place where they will all gather to worship. And the Lord provided for this through King Cyrus. King Cyrus instructed their neighbors in Babylon to provide them with gold and silver and other valuables which will enable them to buy the building materials. He also retrieved for them the original sacred items which were confiscated by the King Nebuchadnezzar. Later, when they faced opposition from their foreign neighbors, the Lord worked through King Darius, a responsible king who bothered to uphold justice for them and permitted them to work to build their temple in peace. Next, they needed to re-establish the law of Moses in the land. And for this, the Lord provided them with the scribe Ezra, who knew and understood the law very well. The later king Artaxerxes instructed Ezra to return to Jerusalem along with the others from the priestly line of Levi, and he also gave them gold and silver from the royal court. Now, why would King Artaxerxes do so? Well, perhaps he was concerned for law and order in Jerusalem, and he didn't want chaos in his empire, and so he sent someone who knew the law of Moses well so that he could keep the people in check. No, regardless, the Lord worked through him to provide priestly guidance for his people. And finally, they needed competent leaders, shepherds who ensure that the people do not stray away again. And the Lord first provided them with a faithful and capable leader in Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of King David's family, and who also returned with the first batch of exiles. Then later on, the Lord provided them with Jeremiah through the hand of King Artaxerxes. Now, Nehemiah was a high-ranking official in the royal court, but the king allowed him to return to Jerusalem to guide the repair of the city walls. Now, why would King Artaxerxes do so? Well, his urgency might be because he was concerned for the security of his empire, since a city without walls will be vulnerable to enemy forces. Again, regardless of the king's motivations, the Lord worked through him to provide his people with another faithful and capable leader. And this leader, Nehemiah, was zealous for the people's holiness, and he worked tirelessly to reform their social life to be in conformity with the law of Moses. So, as the Lord had promised through his prophets, his providential care was with his people, and he brought them back to the promised land, and he re-established their collective identity as his people. And none of this would have happened were it not for his doing. When we get to the end of Israel's salvation story in the Old Testament, found in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we read of how concerned Ezra and Nehemiah were for the law of Moses to be obeyed, and how Nehemiah tried to do everything within his power to keep the errant people in line. And their zealousness, Ezra and Nehemiah's zealousness, right, is understandable because their ancestors had been exiled from the land precisely because of their persistent disobedience. And now that they have returned to the land, they must have felt a certain anxiety to ensure that the commandments of God were properly obeyed so that they do not get exiled again. Even though God had been gracious to them, there was no room for complacency lest they face judgment again. However, it seemed that the people have yet to fully turn their hearts back to the Lord by the end of the salvation story. So despite having returned to Jerusalem, they still seem to be committing the sins that had plagued their ancestors. For example, like neglecting the worship in the temple, having corrupt practices which led to the defilement of the temple, not obeying the Sabbath, which is one of the 10 commandments, marrying foreigners who were worshipping foreign gods, and oppressing the poor and the marginalized. So we hear of the prophecies of God, pouring out His Spirit, writing the law on the hearts of His people so that they will not sin. But it seems that such prophecies have yet to be fulfilled as the people were still disobedient. And furthermore, until the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, God's people remain under the rule of Persia. Even though they have some form of self-governance, the prophecies of being ruled by their own anointed king as an independent kingdom has not come to pass. So Israel's salvation history in the Old Testament ends on this ambiguous note. So certainly being able to return from exile means hope for the people. It's just that prophecies still remain unfulfilled and their future remains somewhat ambiguous, with the threat of unfaithfulness and judgment always on the horizon. So for God's prophecies to be completely fulfilled, more things will still need to be happening, right? More things will still need to happen. And the Lord will need to act in ways which are far more amazing than any of His people can imagine. And we will hear more about this in the next session.